Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, spent much of his life serving as a military officer, where he waged war against Great Britain, Spain, and American Indian tribes. It was his victory over the British in 1815 at the bloody Battle of New Orleans that made him a national hero. Andrew Jackson's influence on U.S. politics was so great that historians call the period of his presidency the Jacksonian Democracy. Jackson and his campaign organizers founded the Democratic Party, a political party that attracted voters by praising the virtues of ordinary working people, such as potters, shoemakers, and blacksmiths. Andrew Jackson was born in a log cabin and enthusiastically promoted his idea of the self-made man, the notion that people can rise from humble beginnings to accomplish marvelous things through discipline and hard work. He lived quite grandly in this large mansion at his plantation called the Hermitage, outside Nashville, Tennessee, and he owned over 100 slaves. Andrew Jackson was nicknamed Old Hickory because of his toughness and his stubborn disposition. He often vetoed, that is, overruled, bills passed by Congress, and he was sometimes accused of acting like a king when he replaced longtime federal officials with his own supporters and when he ignored Supreme Court decisions with which he did not agree. One of the first big challenges Andrew Jackson faced as president concerned the rights of American Indians. Back then, pressure from white settlers and real estate speculators had led the states of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi to seize Native American farmlands. And even though these actions clearly violated federal treaties, President Jackson did nothing to stop them. On the contrary, in 1830, he helped push the Indian Removal Act through Congress. The Indian Removal Act required 5 eastern tribes, the Cherokee, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Seminole, to abandon their farms and move far to the west to what was called the Indian Territory, which is now in the state of Oklahoma. When the Cherokees appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, the court affirmed that the seizure of Indian lands by the states was illegal. Nevertheless, the tribes were forced off their lands anyway. All the tribes suffered enormously due to the Indian Removal Act, but for the Cherokees, things were especially bad. U.S. troops rounded up 15,000 Cherokee men, women, and children and put them in military stockades. Then, under armed guard, the Cherokees were marched off to the Indian Territory, a distance of some 1,200 miles, or 2,000 kilometers. This event has come to be called the Trail of Tears, because when it was over, 4,000 Cherokees had died of starvation and disease. Ironically, White Path, the Cherokee warrior chief buried here on the Trail of Tears, was once awarded a medal for helping Andrew Jackson during a dangerous battle. The era of the Jacksonian Democracy was a time of great technological development in the United States. The year Andrew Jackson was elected, 1828, was the year the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company was founded. After that, steam-powered railroads rapidly replaced horse-drawn carriages and canal boats as a means of transportation in America. Then, in 1831, the old method of harvesting grain with a scythe was made obsolete by Cyrus McCormick's invention called the mechanical reaper, a machine that could harvest grain crops at a very rapid rate. A few years after the reaper was invented, Hiram and John Pitts patented a combine machine for grain farmers. This invention combined harvesting and threshing, which is the process of beating the grain to separate the edible kernels from the inedible stalks and husks. Back then, threshing was occasionally accomplished by running horses over stalks of grain placed on the threshing floor of a barn. And today, the processes of harvesting and threshing are still combined in modern farm machines like the one seen here. A few years after the combine was patented, a man named John Deere invented a wonderful steel plow that could cleanly cut through the heavy soil of the American prairies. Taken all together, the new plows, combines, and reapers enormously sped up the agricultural revolution that had begun in Europe the century before. The new machines made it a lot easier and faster to farm big plots of land, and as a result, helped to greatly increase the world's supply of food. Two other extremely important inventions were also developed at the time Andrew Jackson was president. One was the telegraph, a forerunner of the telephone. It was the first device to use wires and electricity to send messages over long distances. The other invention, which was perfected in France in 1837, was photography, an ingenious process that used light to create an exact image of a subject on a chemically treated metal sheet. These first photographs were called daguerreotypes, after their inventor, Louis Daguerre. In 1832, the year after the new mechanical reaper was invented, Andrew Jackson was re-elected to a second term in the White House. That year, Jackson vetoed a bill that allowed the privately owned Bank of the United States to operate as America's leading financial institution. A year later, he ordered that all the money belonging to the federal government be deposited elsewhere. Jackson's veto was designed to punish the rich and powerful individuals associated with the bank and to destroy the control they maintained over the Treasury of the United States. The year Jackson was re-elected, his former vice president, John C. Calhoun, was in South Carolina in the state legislature working for the passage of the Ordinance for Nullification. This was a controversial new law which nullified, that is overturned, the federal tariff or tax on imported goods. But this state law was illegal under the U.S. Constitution. Nevertheless, South Carolina's angry politicians threatened to secede or break away from the United States if the federal government tried to collect the tax. To put a halt to the rebellion in South Carolina, known as the Nullification Crisis, Jackson nearly sent in troops. But in the end, Congressman Henry Clay of Kentucky helped work out a compromise that lowered the tariff. As a result, war was avoided and the Union of States was maintained. The nullification crisis that nearly broke apart the United States was actually more about states' rights than it was about paying taxes. This was a theory quite popular among the powerful owners of big southern slave plantations, people who feared that the federal government was about to outlaw slavery without their approval. Under the strong states' rights system they favored, a state would be able to overturn a federal law, such as a law that banned slavery, if the state believed the law was unconstitutional. However, the U.S. Supreme Court did not agree with their interpretation of the law. Money was behind much of the debate over states' rights, because plantation owners were worried they would lose some of their wealth if they had to start paying their workers. And they were right to worry, because by the mid-1830s, slavery had been banned not only in the northern free states and territories, but in Canada and Mexico as well. There had always been a strong sentiment against slavery in the northern states, partly because that was where all the abolitionists lived. Abolitionists were people who actively worked to abolish or get rid of slavery. The most famous abolitionist of Jackson's time was William Lloyd Garrison of Massachusetts, who founded the very influential American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833. As the abolitionist movement gained strength in the northern United States, the issue of slavery contributed to a rebellion that was brewing far to the south in Texas. At that time, Texas was still part of Mexico, but American immigrants living in the region had come to outnumber the native-born Mexicans. Many of the 25,000 to 30,000 Americans who had immigrated to Texas after Mexican independence from Spain came from slave states such as Tennessee and Missouri. They had created small farms, but a lot of them hoped to establish large slave plantations like those they had known in the United States. However, in Mexico, slavery had recently been declared illegal. Mexico had also refused to let any more Americans immigrate to Texas. Furthermore, back then, Mexico was controlled by a dictator named General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who had overthrown the government and abolished the Constitution of Mexico. The American immigrants were angered at Santa Anna's actions, but they also wanted the bans on slavery and immigration lifted. By the end of 1835, the Texans had captured the city of San Antonio and had even formed their own government. General Santa Anna decided to put a halt to the rebellion in Texas and assembled a force of 5,000 troops to march on San Antonio. The arrival of the Mexican force surprised the Texans, and they rapidly withdrew behind the walls of the old Spanish mission of San Antonio de Valero, known locally as the Alamo. And it was here that a small group of men decided to fight to the bitter end. Mexican forces laid siege to the Alamo and trapped the defenders inside. And while this was happening, a group of influential Texans issued a Declaration of Independence from Mexico. A few days later, a vicious battle erupted. Mexican forces captured the Alamo and killed almost everyone inside. But even though the Texans lost the Battle of the Alamo, their struggle gave leader Sam Houston the time he needed to gather enough forces to defeat Santa Anna's army a short time later. As a result, an independent nation called the Republic of Texas was born. While Texas gained its independence, the United States held elections, and voters chose Jackson's vice president, Martin Van Buren, to be their new leader. Also that year, just to the northeast of the new Republic of Texas, a 25th state called Arkansas joined the Union as a slave state. 9 years later, the same year that Andrew Jackson died, Texas gave up its independence and was admitted to the Union as a slave state as well. True or false? Andrew Jackson founded the Republican Party. True or false? The abolitionists wished to get rid of laws that banned slavery. True or false? The Trail of Tears resulted from the Indian Removal Act. True or false? McCormick's mechanical reaper was designed for harvesting cotton. True or false? The nullification crisis was over tariffs and states' rights.